Was this man a king, or was he a bank? Today, we think governments control banks. Central banks print money, finance ministries regulate markets, and our elected leaders appear to hold the ultimate authority. But in medieval Europe, the reality was the complete opposite. Back then, kings, emperors, and even popes ruled on borrowed money. And the people who lent that money were not just rich merchants, they were the true power behind the throne. This is the story of how international banking families like the Medici and the Fugger did and just finance kingdoms. They started wars, they decided who became emperor, and they collapsed governments, all without ever wearing a crown. Medieval Europe was a continent almost permanently at war. England was fighting France. Italian city-states were constantly battling each other. The Holy Roman Empire was wrestling with internal rivals, while Spain defended its frontier against the Ottoman Empire. Even the popes were funding armies as often as they were funding prayers. War wasn't just a political act. It was financially catastrophic. Armies required massive, upfront cash for soldiers' salaries, for weapons and armor, for horses and all the logistics of a campaign. And mercenaries, who were essential, fought only for cash. Kings tried to rely on taxes, but medieval tax systems were incredibly weak, slow, and unreliable. A sudden war required instant money, and that gap between a king's ambition and his empty treasury is exactly where the banks entered history. And no bankers were more famous than the Medici family of Florence. They weren't ordinary moneylenders. By the 15th century, they operated the most powerful financial network in Europe. The Medici Bank had branches in all the key cities: Florence, Rome, Venice, London, Paris, and Geneva. They pioneered innovations like double-entry bookkeeping, which allowed them to track risk, debt, and political exposure with an accuracy no one else could match. But most importantly, the Medici were the official bankers of the Pope. Just think about that for a second. If you control the money of God's representative on earth, who truly holds the power? European kings regularly went to the Medici for loans to finance their wars, to pay their restless troops, or to stabilize their collapsing currencies. But Medici loans were never neutral. If a king cooperated with them, credit flowed freely and political support followed. But if a king resisted, or even worse, defaulted on a loan, new credit would vanish. His rivals would quietly receive funding, and his alliances would mysteriously collapse. The Medici rarely fought wars themselves, they simply decided who could afford to fight one. Now, if the Medici mastered the art of banking, the Fugger family of Augsburg, Germany, perfected the art of domination. By the early 16th century, the Fuggers were the richest family in Europe. They controlled vast silver and copper mines, and they were bankers to kings, popes, and emperors alike. They understood a crucial truth: money, combined with control over essential resources, equals absolute power. Their masterpiece came in 1519. The throne of the Holy Roman Empire was up for election. A young noble, Charles of Habsburg, wanted to become Emperor Charles V, but the position wasn't won by bloodline alone. It required enormous bribes to the powerful prince-electors who cast the votes. Charles didn't have the money. The Fuggers did. They financed the bribes, they secured the votes, and Charles V became the most powerful man in Europe. But the question remains, was Charles V really ruling Europe? Or was he ruling on Fugger credit? Medieval bankers understood something that kings often ignored: debt creates obedience. Once a king borrowed money, he was trapped. He needed more loans to finance his next war. The interest on his existing debt accumulated at a frightening pace, and if he defaulted, it meant political ruin. Banks could survive without kings. Kings, however, could not survive without banks. That simple imbalance of power quietly reshaped the entire political landscape of Europe. Of course, some rulers believed their crown made them untouchable. They were wrong. Take King Edward III of England during the 14th century. He borrowed enormous sums from Italian banking houses to finance the 100 Years' War against France. When repayment became impossible, Edward simply defaulted. The result? The major Florentine banks that had lent him the money collapsed. Trade networks froze. Entire cities suffered catastrophic economic depressions. For the bankers who survived, this was a lesson learned in blood and bankruptcy: never lend without control. From that moment on, they tightened their grip on political power even further. So how did banks collapse governments without armies? They didn't need swords. They used financial pressure. Their methods were subtle but devastating. They could refuse to issue new loans right before a major war. They could demand early repayment of existing debts, knowing the king couldn't pay. They would secretly fund political rivals or manipulate currency flows to cause instability. They would influence powerful nobles and church officials who were also in their debt. The consequences for a king were disastrous. Without money, soldiers went unpaid and armies mutinied. To raise cash, the king would have to increase taxes, leading to popular unrest and rebellion. Eventually, kings would fall not to an enemy army on the battlefield, but to an empty treasury back home. So did the banks actually start wars? Not directly. But they absolutely decided which wars were possible. If a war promised a good return on investment through plunder, new trade routes, or access to resources, then loans were approved and supplies flowed. Armies could march. But if a war looked too risky or unprofitable, the credit would dry up. Armies never even formed. This meant something truly revolutionary. Wars were being decided in accounting ledgers, long before they were ever fought on the battlefield. So, who truly ruled? The king wore the crown. The king gave the speeches. The king commanded the armies. But the money belonged to the banks. The credit belonged to the banks. A kingdom's economic survival depended entirely on the banks. In medieval Europe, kings were the symbols of power, but the banks were the system. And whoever controls the system controls the future. Today, the kings and emperors are gone, but debt remains. International lenders, global financial institutions, and complex credit systems still decide which nations can survive, which economies might collapse, and which wars are affordable. History doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. In medieval Europe, the crown sat on a king's head. But power lived in a banker's ledger. So ask yourself again, was he the ruler? Or was the bank? Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, please subscribe for more hidden histories.